Slug It, written by Charles Bran, narrated by Larissa Thompson. Chapter 22. Yes, the woman with the green eyes smiled. You know me. Her hand was still on my shoulder, her smooth, unwrinkled hand. Her eyes and nose were the same, but her cheeks were taut against her cheekbones, emphasizing them in a way her older, slackened skin had not. The bags under her eyes were gone. I couldn't believe it. I just stared at her. I'm glad you made it here, the woman said. The pitch of her voice was the same, but there was something different in the way she spoke. The hint of an accent touched her words, making her sound as though she had walked out of a Cary Grant movie from the 1940s. It was subtle, but it was there. How is this possible? I asked. The woman pursed her lips. It was strange how pretty she looked. It was like seeing an old photo of your grandfather in high school looking completely different. Only that feeling of strangeness was magnified 100-fold by the fact that this person was standing right in front of me, her hand still resting on my shoulder. You have seen a lot of impossible things in the past few days, she said, haven't you? But you're old. Yes, she said, older than you know. I just kept staring at her. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. A moment passed. Slowly, the woman removed her hand from my shoulder. She moved in front of me and knelt until we were both on our knees, facing each other. I could hear Chalmers's breathing behind me, and I knew he was looming over me. The woman looked like a young Valerie Schneider. There was no mistaking that nose and those eyes, at least not after seeing the Red Sox cap and opening my mind to the possibility. My editor was sitting in front of me, young again. I couldn't believe it. And then there was the fact that she didn't sound quite right. Her voice was younger, but she was speaking with a sort of erudite detachment instead of her usual surliness. I just gaped at her. I need to tell you something, Val said. I know you might be angry, but you need to let me explain. My eyes narrowed a little, but I said nothing. I was the one who sent those animals after you. What? I exclaimed, angry. I pulled away from her and scooted back away until I bumped into Chalmers's legs. He was still standing over me. I was still at their collective mercy. The fear that came with that realization made me hesitant. It gripped my throat and strangled the angry words that had been about to bubble out of it. But Val was still talking. I am sorry for what I had to put you through, she said, but there truly was no other way. What? I had to get you in the right frame of mind, to open yourself to the truth, Val said. I wanted to just explain it all directly, but that just would have hardened your doubts, ruined you forever. I don't understand. How could you? What I put you through was a series of escalatingly improbable occurrences, Val said. I wanted you to learn the truth, but I had to be slow, deliberate. I needed you curious, even suspicious. I had to boil the frog. I shook my head. I could barely process what Val was saying. The sting of betrayal had my blood pounding in my ears. You attacked me, I said. That dog ripped into Isabel's arm. You hurt her badly. I am sorry for that, Val said calmly. It is difficult to establish truly fine control over an animal's mind, but even if you hadn't fought back as well as you did, the animals would not have killed anyone. I am confident of that. I looked at her and sputtered. Anger, shock, and disbelief were brawling each other for the top spot in my whirling emotions. How could you? I clenched my fists. Do you have any idea what you put me through? I know, Val said, still calm. I didn't like that tone. She ought to have been upset, to show some signs of regret for what she had done to me. Listen, I do know what I put you through. You don't understand how hard this was for me. I never wanted to harm you. Then why? I demanded. I felt my anger starting to ebb. I knew that I was interrupting her too much, making it more difficult for her to explain herself. She had said that she hadn't meant to hurt Isabel that badly. But I was still upset with her. I folded my arms across my chest to express it. I tried to make sure you were never in danger of any permanent injury, Val said. I had to make you believe in a conspiracy, that someone out there didn't want you to know what had happened to Zev. It put you in the right frame of mind to see the truth. Val leaned forward intently. I had to be aggressive with you, she said. I couldn't repeat my mistakes. She glanced at Zev, who was still unconscious on the mattress. Your mistakes, I said. My voice came out thready. Why are you... What did you do to him? Why is he just lying there? I tried to show him the truth too, but, well, it went poorly. Is he... I am confident he can still be salvaged. Salvaged? I said, outraged. I clambered up onto my feet. The woman in front of me leapt to her feet as well, with a speed and grace that shocked me and made me wary. I can still help him, Val said. Zev is going to be fine. I shook my head, not sure if I could trust her. Please, just listen to me. I can explain. Explain what? I demanded. You saw what that dog did to Isabel's arm, but then you sent a goddamn bear after us! I did, Val admitted. But it was just a flesh wound. If you would listen, fuck that! I couldn't suppress my anger anymore. At that moment, I didn't care how outmatched I was. I wanted to grab the woman in front of me, the woman who was claiming to be my editor. I wanted to grab her and shake her. This wasn't Val. This wasn't the woman who had mentored me, whatever she looked like. But the imposter's hand flashed towards me, quicker than I could react. My enhanced reflexes were still gone. This fox-nosed woman was startlingly fast. She grabbed my wrist. Her grip was gentle compared to Chalmers. After she made contact, she looked into my eyes and said in a commanding tone, "Calm down." And I felt it, a strong pressure in my mind. Her words carried a force with them that made my heartbeat instantly start to slow. Abruptly, I wanted to calm down. I wanted it more than I wanted anything else in the world. But I also didn't want to let this goddamn imposter tell me what to do or what to want. I felt my mind wrestle against the pressure that was slowing my heartbeat, and the pressure shattered in an instant. I defeated it. I was in control of myself. I glared at the woman in front of me. I was about to yank my arm away from her when I realized what I should do. This woman, this imposter, she didn't know that I was not under her control. And, at least for the moment, all she was asking me to do was listen to her. I was standing directly between her and Chalmers. If I started fighting them, I would probably lose. And she was unnaturally quick. When she had grabbed my arm, her hand had whipped toward me like a viper. I had to let her think her command had worked, at least for now. I had to let her believe she had control over me. So I stopped struggling and let my arm rest in her grip. I forced my breathing to start to slow. Okay, I said, struggling to keep my emotions out of my voice. I couldn't give myself away. I had to pretend to be under her control, to be following the order she had given me. Okay, I said again, managing to sound calmer. The woman smiled, and then she loosened her grip on my wrist and let her hand slide down until she was holding my hand in hers. I felt disgusted, but I couldn't react. I couldn't let my emotions show. You have seen a taste of what is possible, she said, but you can hardly imagine. I couldn't sneer at her. This was my chance to get more information. All I had to do was listen. After that was over, I could decide what action to take. I have been alive for 120 years, the fox-nosed imposter explained. When I was a girl, an older man took an interest in me. He put me through a gauntlet to get me to open my mind, just as I have done for you. When my mind was prepared, he revealed his deception and offered me the secret to eternal youth. I was worried that I was about to frown or to react in some way that betrayed the fact that I was in control of myself and had resisted the woman's command to be calm. But I was finding it easier than usual to keep control over my emotions. Maybe it was how crazy this all sounded. Eternal youth? It had to be a lie. And yet, there she was. Her nose and her eyes were unmistakable. I didn't want this woman to be Val, but she was. And she was young again. She definitely sounded younger. The gravel had been removed from her vocal cords, and her choice of words was more sophisticated. She must have been holding this part of herself back every time we had spoken in the past. Every interaction we had ever had was a lie. I could feel that, understand it, but I managed to keep my emotions under control. I knew that I had to stay calm. I had to keep this new Val convinced that I was under her control. That man told me he loved me, that he wanted us to be together forever, but I soon realized that he was not who he claimed to be. Val's grip on my hand was firm. Her voice was tight, and her eyes were watery. She was still hurt by this betrayal. His appetite for young women was insatiable. He told me that possessiveness was a mortal trait, that I would get over it. It was only later that I discovered that he was telling these women the same things he had told me, and when their minds failed to grasp the secrets he tried to share, he slaughtered them, like animals. After I discovered the graves in the cellar, well, we fought. I killed him. Val bit her lip. It was disconcerting how young she looked, especially biting her lip like that. It was the first time I took a life, Val said. I have been in hiding ever since, and I swore that I would never do to anyone what he did to me. Val sighed heavily and continued. I swore I would never do what I have now done to you and to Zev. But times have changed. I knew that I was angry about what Val had done to me. That part of me didn't want to just stand here listening to her justifying herself. But I was managing to keep a lid on my temper, at least for now. I had to remember that my goal right now was to let Val speak. Getting emotional would interfere with that goal. And maybe Val did have good reasons for doing what she had done to us. I could at least give her a chance to explain herself. You need to understand how this world works, Val said. Before I killed that man, I incapacitated him. I forced him to tell me everything he knew, and he was not the last to come after me. He was not the only one I interviewed. It was strange. Interviewing someone was such a mundane part of daily life at the newspaper. But what Val was talking about was far from normal. You would not believe the depths of the psychopaths I have spoken to, she said. For the immortals, restoring youth is easy enough to achieve. But what they really lust for is a way to reach beyond their natural limitations. Power can be taken, but only through murder. And once one has started down that path, one must continue to feed regularly, or one's stolen power will wither and die. Holy shit. Serial killers with superpowers. It should be frightening. It should be terrifying. But I didn't feel it. I just felt calm. Wait, I thought. This wasn't right. Why was I so calm? I should be afraid. Now isn't the time for fear. Wait, I thought. Wait. No, there's nothing to worry about. And I have to keep myself calm, or Val will know that her powers don't affect me. I can't let her find out that I am in control of my own mind. I have to stay calm. I believe there are millions of immortals out there, Val said. Maybe even hundreds of millions. Those I have encountered have regarded themselves as nothing but anemic scavengers, hungry wolves at the bottom of the pack. It is said that the strongest of immortals have cults of followers, foot soldiers who are raised from birth to serve their master, for whom the highest honor is being consumed to feed their master's immortality. Consume, I thought, to feed their immortality. And then I realized what Val had said, what she had let slip. Feeding on life force wasn't just about gaining power. These immortals also killed to sustain themselves, like vampires. Val had been vague when she had said she learned the secret to immortality. She had avoided explaining it, despite how thoroughly she was telling the rest of her story. Val had been careful not to draw too much attention to the fact that she had been aging, that it was only now that she had become young again. Val had done something to make that change happen, and she had avoided saying directly what it was. I knew that it was a guess, but I felt certain that I was right. The secret to immortality was killing. That was why Val looked so young again. She had just killed someone. Her newfound youth was stolen. I had to keep the shock and disgust I felt off of my face. I had to stay calm. Val was still talking, and information was power. All I had to do was let her continue giving it to me, and to let her keep thinking she had power over me. At least until she tried to use her power to force me to do something I didn't want to do. Right, I thought. That was right. I felt good. This was going well. Val didn't suspect a thing. That was why I had to bring you in, both of you. I need your help. Can you imagine the technological transformation I have witnessed in 120 years? The atrocities technology has made possible? And it will get worse. There are cameras everywhere these days. We are on the precipice of a time in which the secrets of the immortals cannot be kept. Inevitably, someone will notice that there are people walking through the world who do not age, and when that happens... Val glanced away, as though she could see a horrible future coming towards us from the darkness of the warehouse. A war is coming, she said. She looked frightened. The future wasn't just an abstract thing to her, I realized. Not after how long she had lived. 120 years. She lived through both world wars, and that had just been the beginning. Listen, Eliza, I have thought about this a lot. I know it sounds like a great deal of supposition, but I have come to believe that a breaking point is inevitable. There will be no putting the genie back into its bottle, not with how communication technology has progressed. I just stared at the young woman in front of me. She seemed to be waiting for me to speak. I don't understand, I said. Val nodded at me, a familiar gesture coming from an unfamiliar face. She was inviting me to ask my questions, as if we were just working on a story together. I tripped over my words. My thoughts were too jumbled. I took in a deep breath, calmed myself, and tried to start at the beginning. Look, your story sounds crazy, I said. But after what I've seen, I can believe you when you say you've had some run-ins with serial killers who have superpowers. Val nodded again. But, she asked, but you're talking about this like it's some big global thing. That's ridiculous. Someone would have noticed. Immortals who kill too frequently or too openly do not last long. Anyone who draws too much attention is inevitably struck down by one of the old ones. The old ones? I blurted out, incredulous. I had heard the phrase before, in fiction. It's not like a formal title, Val said. I am simply referring to the most ancient and powerful immortals. Okay, I said. But if they're so powerful, why do they care about keeping secrets? It's simply the food chain, Val said. All are part of it. Killing for power brings with it diminishing returns. You need stronger and stronger prey to continue to surpass your limits. The old ones are the apex predators. They hunt other immortals. And they hunt one another. The only immortals who survive for very long are those who have learned to keep themselves hidden. So, anyone who goes around bragging about their powers is advertising a free meal. I shook my head. This was impossible. It was insane. How could you know all this? I asked. I didn't just interview immortals. I was lucky enough to also meet someone who gave me some advice, Val said, much like Vince Doberman is in this town. She told me how the little fish stay away from the sharks. I shook my head slowly. Val was painting a bleak and terrifying picture. I didn't want to believe her. What she was saying couldn't be true. It just couldn't. I had to find some way to poke a hole into it. If I didn't, I might panic, and I had to stay calm. I took in a deep breath, and then another. I could keep control over my emotions. It was hard, but I could do it. "Everything you're saying," I said, it's all just hearsay, isn't it?" Val had to see it. We had worked on stuff like this before, on rumors that went floating around. She knew that you couldn't believe everything you heard. I looked at Val's strangely youthful face, hoping to see doubt in her eyes. But her gaze was steady and confident. "Listen to me, Eliza," Val said. She laid a hand on my shoulder and gave it a gentle squeeze. "I know this is frightening. I know that it's hard to accept, but you have to trust me. I may look different, but I'm still me." My own eyes widened as I looked into Val's. There was something in the way Val had touched my shoulder that seemed to communicate the age and maturity of the young-looking woman in front of me. I realized that Val really was as old as she said she was, and that she wasn't stupid. She probably hadn't wanted to believe any of this was true either. Not at first. I knew Val. She wasn't lacking in skepticism. I had to trust what she was telling me. I had to trust her. I didn't want to, not after everything Val had done to me and the collateral damage she had inflicted on Isabel. But Val was the only one in the world who could help me navigate this terrifying new world. I had no choice but to put my faith in her. It was overwhelming. I tried to breathe and found that I could manage it. I was holding it together, at least with Val's hand on my shoulder. There was something powerfully comforting in the gesture. It was a reminder that even if the world was full of horrible and terrifying danger, Val was here, and she was looking out for me, just like she had when I was a fledgling reporter. I wasn't alone. "I wish we had more time for you to process all this. I wish I didn't have to thrust all of this onto your shoulders all at once," Val said. Val squeezed my shoulder again and then let go, but the comforting sense of warmth remained with me. "But we have to prepare ourselves. When the secret of the immortals is out, it will be harder to hide an entire cult than a single person. At that time, I believe the oldest and most powerful immortals will see only one path forward: open control over the world, or failing that, at least a territory." I shook my head slowly. Part of me still wanted to reject what she was saying. But I couldn't. I could see that she was telling the truth. I could see it in the steadiness of her bright green eyes. "You have seen what I can do," Val said. "What Chalmers can do. Imagine the havoc of millions with powers far greater than ours fighting one another." I looked at the ground. It was overwhelming. But I wasn't alone. Val was here, and I had to trust her, not because I wanted to, but because there was no one else. I could handle this. I could stop myself from panicking. I could stay calm and put my trust in Val. For years I told myself that I was the only one who saw this coming, that I have done more than any other immortal to keep my finger on the pulse of society, Val said. But as it becomes more obvious, as more and more technology goes from idea to reality, at this point, I am sure that I am not the only one who sees the writing on the wall. The old ones are out there, preparing for the war. No one wants to be the first to act, the first to expose themselves. So they are waiting for circumstances to force action, quietly watching the widening of the gyre. I felt my eyes starting to water, despite myself. I was trying to stay calm, but I couldn't help it. I was afraid. I looked up at Val, at the young woman who looked familiar and unfamiliar. She was looking at me, too, with a wan smile on her face. I didn't want her to see that my eyes had gone watery. I turned away again, looking into the darkness of the warehouse. I regret the pain I caused you, but it was better than allowing you to face the future unprepared, both of you. Val glanced over toward Zev, still sleeping on the mattress, her expression fond. We need to ready ourselves, find and recruit as many allies as we can, but we have to choose them carefully. People who will remain loyal and not be corrupted by power. People like the both of you. Val turned that fond expression toward me. I have gotten to know you over the years, she said. You act tough, but you do it because of how deeply empathetic you are. You're curious about other people. You care about them, about knowing them for who they really are, the good and the bad. And you care about the truth. There was pride in her voice. As a reporter, you have power over people, the power to push your own point of view, Val said. But I have never seen you abuse it. When you have an opinion, I see you trying to keep it out of your stories, to see things from the perspective of the people you're writing about. Even when someone's rude to you, even when you have to deal with Paul Buffino, your integrity never wavers. The truth is too important to you. It pained me to hear her talking like that, and the way she was looking at me with admiration in her eyes. I had wanted to hear these words, to feel this gaze, but I wanted it from my editor, from the woman whose wrinkled face I knew well. I was being forced to trust this unfamiliar-looking young woman by the circumstances I had found myself in, but she still didn't really feel like someone I knew. The circumstances aren't what is forcing you to trust her. She told you to. That thought appeared in my head, almost like a voice whispering in my ear. But it didn't make sense. I brushed it aside. Well, Val said, now that you understand what the future holds for us, there is one more thing to discuss before we attend to Zev. She turned away from me. Reuben, come here, please. Chapter 23. The lamp cast long shadows across the darkness of the warehouse. Zev was still sleeping peacefully beside it, his bleached blonde hair bright above the brown skin of his face. He was still alive, next to that lamp, shining beside him like a beacon. Whatever happened next, Zev was alive. We were going to get out of this, both of us. We were going to face this insanity together. Things were going to start making sense again. Val let go of my hand as she moved to stand beside Chalmers. His gangly height made her look even smaller and younger. Before we proceed, I want you to understand why I saw fit to take this man's free will away from him, Val said, now standing between us. I saw the man's eyes go wide, but that was his only reaction. Reuben, Val said, what is the worst thing you've ever done? Your biggest regret? The tall man's eyes started to water. I could tell his throat was tight as he started to speak. He said, I didn't mean to. It was an accident. Tell me what happened, Val said. I didn't mean to, Reuben said again. He shook his head, his eyes getting wetter. I didn't mean to. Val looked at the man with surprise that quickly shifted to anger. She reached out and grabbed his hand before turning back to me. For a second, I noticed how strange the sight in front of me was, the authoritative, irritated expression on the young woman as she reached out and grabbed the hand of the much older man, his skin looking weathered next to hers. The touch of the 1940s accent gave Val's voice some gravitas, but her appearance was of a girl who could have been even younger than me. It felt strange watching such a young-looking woman act so authoritative towards a middle-aged man. Tell her what happened, Val said, her voice firm. Tell her what you did. Killed a girl, Chalmers said. He was crying in earnest now, and his voice was tight. But I didn't mean to, he said. I was drunk, and I didn't see her. Tears were streaming down the man's face. I looked at him, horrified. And then I saw that Val was looking at me, as though trying to gauge my reaction. I didn't like where this was going. I had a feeling that Val wasn't trying to justify only the fact that she had taken over the man's mind. She was trying to justify something else, something that she was about to do to him. "Tell me what you think," Val said, "your honest reaction." I felt something inside me shift, but I couldn't place what it was. Tension, maybe. I felt tense. And it made sense. I had just been asked to pass judgment on a man. It wasn't the sort of thing you did with a calm mind. Val just looked at me, waiting. For a moment, I wasn't sure it was safe to tell Val what I really thought. But that was just a feeling, no doubt a result of the fact that the woman in front of me didn't look or sound like the Val I remembered. But she was Val. I could tell her what I really thought, couldn't I? She'd always encouraged me to speak openly if I disagreed with her. "He made a mistake, a horrible mistake, but I don't think that makes it okay to just control him like that." "He took a life," Val said, "an innocent life." "It wasn't my fault," Chalmers sobbed. "It was dark. She shouldn't have been walking out there in the dark. And there wasn't even a sidewalk. She shouldn't have been out there." I frowned at the gangly man. He was crying. He clearly regretted what had happened. But to blame the girl he had killed? It was horrible. Maybe it was the only way he could handle what he had done. But after hearing the man say that, I could no longer feel sorry for him. I wasn't sure what to feel. He looked so pathetic, with tears streaming down his face. "It wasn't my fault," Chalmers whispered. "Shut up," Val snapped, her voice suddenly cold and absolutely commanding. She let go of the man's hand. Chalmers hung his head and looked at the floor. I could see more tears falling onto the ground. Val's eyes were cold. Her eyes were the only part of her that looked as old as she was. I don't understand," I said. "What does this have to do with Zev? You said you could help him." Val smiled. "That's my girl," she said. "You never were easily distracted." My throat tightened with emotion. Those words had reached down into my heart and plucked the strings like a harp. This is what I had always wanted from Val, even if I had never admitted it to myself. I wanted her to be proud of me, to praise me, to talk about me as if we were family. But even if it didn't feel like it, this woman was Val. And the way we had connected over our work at the newspaper, maybe that hadn't been a lie. Val had kept secrets from me, but she had still been my editor. She still knew my writing, my point of view. She had helped me to clarify things, to clarify my writing, and by extension, my thinking. But I suspected that she had killed someone, stolen her youth. Had she killed someone? I didn't know for sure. And even if she had, she was still Val. I had to let her explain, to understand, to at least give her a chance before condemning her. Val was opening her mouth to speak, but the rush of emotion that rose up in me had words spilling out of my mouth and interrupting her before I knew what I was doing. I needed to know. "Did you kill someone?" I asked. Is that why you're young again?" Val's smile faded. "Yes," she said. I stared at her in shock and revulsion. I didn't want to believe that Val was a murderer, but she had just admitted it. Half of her face was in shadow, a shadow cast by the gangly man who was standing between her and the propane lantern that sat on the ground next to the mattress, the IV, and the unconscious Zev. No, I thought. I didn't want it to be true. "It was self-defense," Val said. I breathed a sigh of relief. "It was?" "Every time," Val said. "I've never taken a life from someone who did not first engage in violence against me." And that's how you became young again? I took the essence of someone who attacked me. The essence? The energy of life. And of magic. You stole someone's life force? Only from people who were trying to kill me, Val said. I nodded, slowly. Maybe it was okay, I thought, if it was self-defense. Defending yourself against a murderer was justified, wasn't it? Even if it was lethal? How many? I asked. My voice quavered. I wasn't sure that I wanted to know, but I had to know. I was 17 years old when I took my first essence, to stop that man from continuing to murder all those women, Val said. I took my second essence when I was 60. I bit my lip. And that was self-defense? I asked. I was attacked from time to time. A young woman who traveled alone stuck out quite a bit in those days. And there have always been immortals out there, looking for powerful people to feed upon. When my body began to age and my abilities were becoming weaker, I told myself I needed to renew my strength. So I did. But I had condemned myself to another 30 years of running from place to place. The second time I started to age, I realized the gift I had been given. Growing older would be the perfect camouflage from those who hunted me. I could settle down somewhere, have a career. I guess that's over now. Val was still looking away from me, looking wistful, or maybe haunted. I couldn't tell if Val's expression meant that she regretted the loss of her normal life and career at the newspaper, or whether she was still haunted by the lives she had taken. Both, maybe. Did you... I hesitated, but I knew that I could be honest with Val, so I continued. You didn't, drink blood or something like that? The young-looking woman laughed, a sound that made me relax, at least a little. Fortunately, I do not have to resort to something so crude, Val said. Once I have someone under my control, I can pull their essence from them using my mind. But there are those out there who do things differently. I bit my lip. Part of me wanted to laugh too, but nervously. But we were talking about killing, about the ending of lives. And you've never just, I frowned. It's always been self-defense? Always, Val said. I took in another breath. Val wasn't a murderer. She just did what she had to do to survive. She had lived in a harsh world that I was now a part of because of her. But if she was right about what was coming, it would be better to be someone who knew, someone who could fight. It was always better to know the truth. At least, Val said, her voice quiet. So far. My eyes widened. No. She couldn't be saying, so far? I asked. We find ourselves with an uncomfortable choice, Val said. I believe Zev's sanity can be restored, but to do so, I must channel the essence from a healthy mind into his. What? Chalmers was still standing next to Val, hanging his head and twitching with silent sobs. You mean... I asked. Val just nodded, gravely. She was talking about murder, about killing Chalmers so that Zev could live. But there had to be another way. But how bad is he? I asked. Worse than you can imagine, Val said. I felt my fists clench. After all this, Zev was supposed to be okay. After everything I had gone through, it can't be. It can't. He has lost his grip on the world and on himself, Val said. Zev now both believes in magic and does not. He's completely incoherent and vulnerable. I felt my fingers digging into my palms. It couldn't be. After all this, it couldn't be. I have been forced to keep him sedated, Val said. I used to have command over a pack of wolves, for protection if another immortal discovered me, but the pack was slaughtered by a monster that took possession of Zev's mind. A monster? Unless his sanity can be restored, Zev will be completely unable to fight for control over himself. I only just managed to restrain the demon by commanding Zev to sleep, but he can't sleep forever. My fists were still clenched, and they had started shaking. How? How is this possible? I cannot explain it all, Val said, but magic, the energy of magic, I believe it is alive, with a will of its own. Usually, you call upon magic that exists in harmony with your mind and shares your intent, but the disharmony in Zev's mind makes him vulnerable. None of what Val was saying was making sense to me. I just blinked at her. I will teach you the basics later. It is enough that you understand we cannot let Zev wake until his sanity has been restored. If that thing gets out again... I shuddered. A monster was inside Zev. A literal monster. Maybe like the scarecrow. Probably worse. After all, as frightening as the scarecrow had been, I had killed it, and I had been only a child with a lighter and butter spray. But I couldn't let Zev die. I turned to look at him. He looked peaceful, lying on the mattress. My own eyes were wide with fear. As I said, we face a difficult decision. I looked at Chalmers. He had stopped sobbing and was now staring silently at the floor. He could hear us, but Val had control over his mind. She had forced him to stand and wait while we talked about ending his life. You can't, I said. I mean, I know what he did, but... It isn't just that, Val said. It isn't just one mistake in an otherwise virtuous life. She seized the man by the hand again. He didn't move. Tell her, Val said. When was the last time you drove drunk? I'm careful, Chalmers said, without looking up from the ground. His voice was desperate and high-pitched. I'm always careful. Val turned to stare at the man. I could see her grip tightening on his hand. Tell her, Val insisted. It was 2 weeks ago, Chalmers said. 2 days before I pressed you into my service, Val said. And what about the time before that? 2 or 3 days before, he choked out. He looked up at Val, his face screwed up with emotion. And then, as though some dam inside the man had broken, more words came out in a flood. I do it all the time, Chalmers said. I don't have anyone who will drive me home from the bar, but I'm always careful. I'm always really careful. I've never hurt anyone else, just a couple of little accidents. No one got hurt. And what did you do when you got into one of those little accidents? Chalmers was starting to sob. I couldn't stay. I couldn't lose my license, and it's not my fault. People shouldn't park on the street, and their insurance will cover it anyway. Chalmers sounded desperate. He was pleading for his life, and he knew he wasn't doing a good job of it. I looked down at the man, and the tears on his face. I glared at him. I couldn't help it. I was disgusted. His tears meant nothing if he didn't change his actions. He had killed a girl with his recklessness, and he was still harming people, or at least their property. From the sound of it, he was hitting parked cars and fleeing the scene. And when it happened, the man just blamed the victims and kept on with it. If he was driving drunk enough to hit parked cars, he could have easily killed someone else. Luck was the only reason he hadn't yet. Chalmers was contemptible. I felt my lips curling into a scowl. Val must have seen the expression on my face. It changes your view of people when you can make them tell you all the secret things they've done. Val's voice was quiet and sad. I looked at Chalmers. His face was wet with tears. But whatever regrets he had were not enough to stop him from continuing to put lives at risk. He was only crying now because he'd been caught and forced to confess. I looked at Zev, still asleep and still looking peaceful. I wanted him to wake up. I wanted him to be okay. I don't know, I said. I cut myself off. No, I thought. What was right and wrong didn't change, even if a dark part of you wished it would. No, I said with a heavy sigh. This man is not a good person, and I want to save Zev, but murder is murder. Val smiled wanly. I know that it's disturbing, taking it upon yourself to judge who lives and who dies. I understand your hesitation. You're a good person, Eliza. That's why I chose you. She turned to look me in the eyes. Bright green eyes that were so much older than the face that housed them. But even though something may be difficult to do, might seem abhorrent, that does not change whether it is right or wrong. You have to look at the big picture. A war is coming. We will need Zev's help. He could save hundreds of lives, innocent lives. Val gave Chalmers a look of utter contempt. And this man is not innocent, she said. Ask yourself, is the world better off with this man in it or with Zev? I bit my lip and turned away from Val's gaze. I couldn't meet her eyes. I wanted to agree with her, but I couldn't. We have to find some other way. We can keep Zev sedated or something, or... Wait, if we took him to a hospital, to a place where there are lots of people, all those people would stop magic from working, right? He wouldn't be able to conjure up the monster. Val winced. I wish it was that simple, she said, but it's a matter of power against power. Doubt can be a powerful force, but this monster is strong, and there is no way we could convince a sufficiently strong group of people to watch Zev at all hours, day and night. And it is possible the monster would manifest anyways. Maybe in a subtle way at first, a pounding on a window or a door. It would make people afraid, prime their minds to expect something bad to appear. All it needs to manifest is to start a cascade of fear. Then we have to think about the problem more, I said. Val walked over to me and put a hand on my shoulder. Shh, Val said. I opened my mouth, but no words came to me. I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to do this to you, Val said, but you have to hear yourself say it. So, Eliza, I need you to hear the truth in your heart. I want you to answer just one question. Everything else is a distraction. The scorpion in the back of my mind skittered. Answer me this, Val said. If one of them has to die, would you rather it be your friend Zev or this murderer? I answered before I could think about it. I want to save Zev, I said, but... The word died in my mouth. Just one question, Val had said. She was trying to make things simple, to show me why she was right. But no, I thought. She wasn't right. But she was, I thought. I had just heard myself say it. When it came down to it, someone had to die. But Zev was the one who should live. What? No, it's not that simple. I closed my mouth and opened it again. I couldn't talk. I wanted to, but I couldn't. Because I knew that Val was right. Zev deserved to live more than Chalmers did. No, I thought. No, I don't believe that. Just be quiet. Val is doing what needs to be done. If I shut up, Val was going to murder someone, not in self-defense, but to take life from one person to give it to another. Zev might deserve to have his sanity back more than Chalmers deserved to live, but that didn't matter. There are some lines you just can't cross. I didn't cross any lines. All I did was answer a question like Val had asked. She wasn't asking me to commit murder or to agree with what she was doing. She was just explaining herself, and I didn't say I was okay with it. I just answered one simple question. I had implied my approval. I had to clarify. I had to explain. Val knew I didn't approve. That was why she said she only wanted to hear me answer one narrowly worded question. And Val was older than me. Much, much older. She had a broader perspective on things. I should just shut my mouth and let her do what she was going to do. Isn't this what I wanted anyway? I wanted Zev back. And Chalmers, he was a bastard. The only reason he hadn't killed another girl was that he was lucky enough to have only wrecked some parked cars instead. I know this is hard, Val said, but someday you will understand. She let go of my shoulder and turned to Chalmers. The man had started crying again, but crying silently. Tears were streaming down his cheeks, but even his breathing was quiet. Val had told him to shut up. He was being forced to face the end of his life in silence. Maybe Val was right. Maybe someday I would understand. Maybe the ends justify the means, at least when the stakes are high enough. No! The ends do not justify the means. That idea, it sounded good, but it was the proverbial path to hell paved with good intentions. It was the animus behind every witch hunt that had ever happened. It was the Nazis. It was Unit 731. The most monstrous things that ever happened had happened because people had made excuses for unconscionable actions. That was when I realized that I was not immune to Val's ability to influence minds. I had done everything she had said. When she had given her first command, I had felt it like a pressure in my head. I thought I had fought off that pressure, but I hadn't. The mechanism behind the mind control had just gotten clever. It was a voice whispering in my head, sounding like my own thoughts. Val told me to do something, and the voice spoke up, telling me why I should do it, why I should choose to do it. Val was bending down toward Zev. She was telling Chalmers to kneel down next to him. But I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was paralyzed. This is confusing and scary. I can't handle this. I've frozen up. No, I can't freeze up. I have to fight this thing. I have to tear it out of my head. And then suddenly, I could feel it. A buzzing, vibrating energy in my head. The power thrummed, just like the power I had sensed the first time I had used magic, when I had burned that bear with a flash of light. But this power was different, thrumming with a different frequency, like a sound with a higher pitch. I grasped onto that power, not moving my hands, but reaching out with my mind. I pulled at the thrumming vibration in my head and felt it slip down my throat, falling down into my chest, warming my stomach. I swallowed the power, and warmth spread through me. It was the feeling of warmth you get from sipping a cup of hot coffee during the bitter cold of the darkest winter days. And in that instant, I knew for certain that my thoughts were entirely my own again. The energy that I had swallowed had been the source of the whisper in my head, and I had pulled that energy out of my brain, shoved it into my stomach, and broken it into raw power. The power inside me moved. The warmth of it rushed up my arm and into my right hand, and I felt more of it flowing back up my spine and settling behind my eyes. I glanced down at my hand and realized with surprise that I could see green energy pulsing there, sparking and swirling. It was the same shade of bright green as Val's eyes. But I could also see my hand unobscured. I knew I wasn't really seeing the energy. My eyes were still just showing me my hand, but the image came into my mind as a distinct visual impression, almost like I was daydreaming or trying to imagine what the thrumming energy might look like if I could see it. It was a visual metaphor that appeared in my mind without the need to exert any effort to visualize it. In the same way I couldn't truly see the energy, I couldn't truly hear it. And yet I had an audible impression too. The energy was singing, high-pitched and shrill, like the sound you could make by rubbing a wet finger on the rim of a wine glass. I looked up and saw, but did not see, and heard, but did not hear, more of the singing green energy. There was a huge, burning aura of it around Val. Tiny tendrils of power were running out of her mouth, swirling and dancing like smoke. I could see the tendrils lapping out of her and crashing like waves against the forms of the people next to her. Chalmers was sitting on the ground. Val was kneeling on the mattress between the gangly, kneeling man and the short, slender figure on the bed. One of her hands lay on Chalmers's forehead, and the other was on Zev's. Behind the green energy, I saw vibrant, bone-white power swirling around Zev, whispering with the sound of the wind, and a steady, brown aura around Chalmers, crashing with the sounds of drums. And then I realized what I was doing. What I had been doing this whole time. Doberman had turned to smell Chalmers at the same instant I had. I was doing what he could do. I had dyed myself his color and started playing his tune, only maybe a little differently, on my own instrument. And when I had unleashed that flash of light that had burned the bear, scaring it away, I had been doing what Isabel could do, but again, a little different. She said her ability was all light and no heat, and in her body it was. But I had taken the same type of energy into a different body, my body, and when I used that energy, it produced a different result. Now, it was Val's power that I held in my hand. I could do what Val could do, or something like it. Maybe I could stop her before she made a horrible mistake, before she became a murderer. "Stop!" I shouted. 2 pairs of eyes snapped over to me. Val's eyes were wide. "Eliza?" she said. She looked shocked, but not angry. That was good. I didn't want to fight her, but I couldn't let her kill a man. I couldn't let her cross this line. I focused on the tendril of energy pouring out of Val's mouth and into Chalmers, and raised my hand, the same hand I had used to free myself. I reached out, physically reached out into the air, like I was grasping a set of reins, and I pulled the energy off of Chalmers. The green tendrils whirled over to my hand like smoke, swirling like water being sucked into a drain. "Don't let her do this to you," I said to the man. "Get back!" Chalmers leapt away from Val without hesitation, but I could tell that he was doing it of his own volition, and not because I had compelled him. I had pulled the green energy off of him, but no tendrils had come out of my mouth and attached to him. Chalmers bolted. When he reached the door, he didn't bother reaching for the handle. He just threw both arms out and slammed against it, smashing it out of the wall with a deafening crunch as the door was ripped right out of the masonry around it. I whipped my head back toward Val and saw her looking at Zev, her mouth open in horror. Zev's eyes were open. The tendrils of energy she had been channeling into him were gone. And then I realized I had acted too rashly. I hadn't known what I was doing. When I had grabbed the energy in front of me to rip it off of Chalmers, I had grabbed it all. I had ripped Val's power away from Zev, too. And the only reason Zev had been sleeping peacefully had been because Val had commanded him to sleep. "Eliza!" Val said. "What have you done?" Zev stirred. And then his mouth twisted into a crooked smile. Chapter 24. Zev started laughing, a high-pitched cackle of glee that I'd heard many times before. I smiled. For a second, I thought he was okay. I was about to start laughing, too. But then I saw Val, backing away from him, looking scared. Zev started sitting up, still hooting with laughter. There was no reason for him to be laughing so hard. Something was wrong. That was when I realized it might not be Zev laughing. It might be that thing Val had warned me about, the monster. Zev sat up, and the small white blanket slid off of his shoulders, revealing a shirtless torso partially covered in bandages. His midriff was bare, and the skin there looked unharmed. Below that, he wore a pair of jeans. There were horrible, blistered burns at the edges of the bandages covering his right shoulder and arm. The fire at Northside. Zev had gotten burned. At that thought, an image came to me in a flash. It hit my mind like a sucker punch, literally throwing me off balance. I swayed on my feet, barely managing not to fall to my knees. I saw Zev standing in a doorway, the doorway to his room at Northside. His arms were folded and he was glaring at me. "Look," he said, "that's not funny." I struggled to push the vision out of my mind before I fell into the concrete. I still didn't know where the visions were coming from. Maybe it was some untapped power inside me. But at the moment, the visions weren't useful, just a distraction. I had to focus on what was going on in front of me. I shoved the sounds and images aside and found myself windmilling my arms to keep from falling over. After I regained my balance, I turned my eyes toward Zev. He had reached down and grasped the blanket that was over him with his good hand, which is to say the one covered in visible burns rather than the one covered in bandages. Zev lifted the blanket and threw it, and the blanket swept into the air as if it had been caught by a breeze. For a second, the blanket hung there floating in the middle of the huge, dimly lit room. It was suspended in the air, looking as if it were draped over a person, but there were no legs sticking out underneath it. I just stared at it, confused. Abruptly, the blanket ripped, as though invisible hands were tearing it from the inside. Even though the sound of the cloth ripping was quiet, it made me jump as the blanket ripped in two places near the apex. Two small rips that looked like eye holes. The blanket had turned itself into a low-budget Halloween costume. It looked silly. Was this the terrifying monster that Val had warned me about? Was it invisible and dressing itself up as a ghost, trying to scare me? I glanced back at Zev. He had fallen back onto the mattress and was staring blankly up at the ceiling. It looked like he had fallen unconscious with his eyes stuck open. The blanket was still just floating in the air, as if waiting on a doorstep for Halloween candy. The idea of an invisible monster was intimidating, but this thing just looked silly. I took a step toward Zev. The blanket whirled in the air, as if it had seen me moving toward it through its eye holes. Before I could react, the blanket was swooping down onto the propane lantern that was the sole source of illumination in the room. Everything went dim, and then, with a squeaking sound, the turning of a valve, the dim light under the blanket went out, leaving the room in darkness. I stumbled, disoriented. The only thing I could see was a small pool of moonlight on the concrete floor on the far end of the warehouse, where Chalmers had knocked the door out of the wall. My night vision was gone, and my eyes were struggling to adjust to the darkness. I could barely make out my own pale hands when I glanced down. Fear caused my fists to clench involuntarily. The floating blanket had seemed unthreatening when I could see it, but now I was alone in the darkness. A moment passed, but it hardly mattered to my eyes. I still couldn't see anything but the tiny pool of light by the door. I couldn't see Zev, Val, or the blanket. I wouldn't be able to see an attack coming. Something could jump at me at any moment. I struggled to keep calm, to slow my racing heartbeat. It was just a blanket, for Christ's sake. Whatever entity had come out of Zev had decided to rip eye holes into the blanket and to make itself look like a cheesy Halloween costume. How bad could something be if it thought that was an effective way to scare people? Maybe it wasn't as horrible as Val had thought. A hot breath tickled the back of my neck. I jumped and whirled my fist back, but I struck nothing but empty air. I thought I heard something, a whooshing sound. Was it the blanket flying through the air? I found myself backing away from the center of the room, retreating further into the darkness until I felt my back press into a cold stone wall with the texture of bricks. My neck was tingling after that touch of heat and moisture. Even the memory of the sensation made my chest tighten with fear. But whatever was out there in the darkness, at least now it couldn't get behind me. I struggled to keep my breathing quiet. My heartbeat was pounding against my chest so violently that it hurt. My hands were shaking, palms wet and sweaty against the cold bricks behind me. That was when a voice called out into the darkness. "Little girl!" It was Zev's voice, I thought. It was coming from his direction, but he sounded wrong. The voice was hoarse and scratchy, and the pattern of words didn't have Zev's cadence. And why was he calling me little girl? I wanted to answer Zev's voice, but I felt terrified. Maybe he was suffering from amnesia and calling out for help, and maybe I could help him. Or maybe he was drawing attention to himself. Maybe the monster was going to find him by the sound of his voice. "Little girl," Zev called hoarsely. "Where are you?" Could Zev be calling for Val? She wasn't a child, but he might not know who she really was. What Zev was saying didn't make sense. There were no children here, but he might be delirious or drugged up on painkillers. He was covered in burns, hurt bad. I wasn't hurt. I was shaky and terrified, but there was nothing wrong with me. I couldn't let Zev's voice be the only one calling out into the darkness. If he had woken up in the darkness, he needed to know he wasn't alone. "Zev?" My voice came out weakly. I swallowed, steeling myself, and then shouted, "Zev, are you okay?" Darkness cut into the stretch of moonlight on the floor, and I flinched and whirled my eyes to the source of the new shadow. It was the ghost, standing in the doorway, standing right in the path of the only visible means of escape. One corner of the blanket was twisted into a cloth tendril that wrapped itself around the handle of the unlit propane lantern, holding it at one side. Zev's hoarse voice broke into a sing-song. "Little girl, I found you." Fear made my already clenched fists tighten painfully. I turned to peer into the darkness, to where the sound of the voice was coming from, but I could see nothing but blackness. That was when another sound made me jump and almost cry out, a harsh, staccato clanking of metal and glass. My eyes snapped back to the ghost in the pool of moonlight, and I saw it shaking the propane lantern, rattling the metal handle against the steel and glass frame. It was loud, shockingly loud, and surprisingly threatening. The blood in my legs froze, and terror clamped down on my throat. By shaking the lantern, the floating blanket had made something clear. Even if it was just a blanket, it was dangerous. It was swinging around a large object of metal and glass, rattling it around with enough force that it was clear that the thing could use the lantern to smash in a skull. "Little girl," Zev's voice spat, suddenly sounding angry. "It's impolite not to answer." My feet were welded to the floor. My back was frozen against the wall. I couldn't breathe. I was a terrified prey animal, holding completely still and hoping that the predator wouldn't see me. "It's been so long, little girl," the voice shouted, harsh, hoarse, and furious. "So long since that day." The voice laughed again, darkly. Somewhere underneath my terror was a note of confusion. "You burned me!" Zev's voice shouted, frothing with rage. The ghost in the doorway started whirling the lantern faster, clanking less, but showing how much force the blanket could put into its swings. It wasn't Zev talking. I was sure of that now. But it couldn't be. It wasn't. No. Please, no. "You burned me!" the hoarse voice shouted again. There was only one explanation that fit what the monster using Zev's voice was saying. It was the Scarecrow. The monster that had tried to kill me when I was a girl. The memory that had come back to me when I had passed out at Isabel's house, when I had realized that all the nightmares I'd had of that thing were real, were based on repressed memories. I hadn't had time to reflect on the memories I had recovered. When I had woken up in the arms of Vince Doberman, there were other things to think about, especially when Chalmers had come for me. I hadn't stopped to consider that maybe the scarecrow wasn't dead, that maybe it was out there, furious about what I had done to it. "You murdered me!" the scarecrow shouted. I flinched at the rage in the scarecrow's voice. Somehow it was using Zev to speak. Somehow it had control over his vocal cords. But it didn't sound like the scarecrow was able to move Zev's body, or at least hadn't yet. The voice was still coming from the same direction, from where Zev lay supine on the mattress. The scarecrow, or whatever it truly was, had somehow possessed Zev before, if what Val had said was true. This was the monster that Val had forced Zev to sleep in order to contain. I didn't understand how it had happened, but Zev had been possessed by the same creature that had tried to kill me when I was a little girl. It had used him to find a new body for itself, a body made out of cloth, much like the body it had used when it had taken the form of the scarecrow. "I was only playing with you, helping you even, you ungrateful little snot!" I didn't understand what the monster was saying. It had threatened me. It had come after me with a knife. But there was a fury in its voice that did not require much in the way of thought or reason. I was petrified, filled with a child's fear. The terror it had inspired in me when I was a kid was something I had never really processed. I had just buried it, forgotten about it. But now, again, I felt like a helpless child, alone and unable to get my father to protect me. My knees were shaking. My lungs were burning. I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was going to pass out. But if I did, I knew the thing would get me. I had to breathe. But my body was petrified. I couldn't move, not even to take in a breath. Damn it, breathe! I clenched my fists hard, digging my nails into my palms. I choked in one breath and then another. If this monster was the scarecrow, then I had driven it off once before. If what it said was true, I had killed it. It had come back to life somehow, but it was not invulnerable. And I had only been a child the last time. I was stronger now. Based on what Val had said, I had to guess that the monster was somehow using Zev to get into the world. If it was dead, maybe it really was a ghost that had possessed Zev. It was speaking using his voice. But now it was also in the blanket. Zev had put his hand on the blanket before it started moving on its own. That had to be significant. Maybe this thing needed a body made of cloth. Or maybe it wasn't just cloth. It had torn eye holes into the blanket. First it had been a scarecrow, and now it was a Halloween ghost. Either way, it had a body, something that could be harmed, something I could fight against. But if I destroyed the blanket, would that be enough? Or would the thing still be inside Zev? The ghost abruptly stopped swinging the lantern. It turned away, eye holes facing a spot on the opposite side of the pitch blackness inside the warehouse. "You won't get away!" Zev's voice screamed, furious. The ghost lifted the lantern, raising it in front of the ripped holes in the blanket, as if to examine it. Somehow, it was seeing out of those holes. That was impossible, of course. They were just tears in fabric. But everything I had experienced in the last day had been impossible. Trying to make sense of things didn't matter now. What mattered was that the ghost was facing away from me. For some reason, it thought I was on the other side of the warehouse, trying to get away. Which meant that if I was able to slip down a hallway on this side of the warehouse, it wouldn't know where I had gone. I started sidling along the concrete wall, moving slowly and quietly. Soon, I felt the wall behind me end. Empty air behind my left shoulder blade, a doorway. I could run into the hall. It was pitch black in there, but I could feel my way around. I could try to hide, maybe find another exit from the building, run down the hill, get to the van. I saw the blanket twisting itself more, forming a second tendril arm on the opposite side of the first. The second tendril grasped the dial on the lantern and twisted it. It was trying to turn the lantern back on, but it hadn't done it right. The ghost was looking down at the lantern, apparently puzzled. If the lantern worked similar to other ones I had seen, the ghost had turned the gas on. Now, all the lantern needed was a spark. Either it had a sparking device built into it, or it needed to be lit from a match. If the lantern was self-sparking, the ghost would figure it out soon enough. If I was going to run deeper into the button factory building, I had to do it now. I took in a deep breath, readying myself. But a thought stopped me. I could run down the hallway, but then what? It was the same, I realized. The same choice I had faced when I was a little girl. I could have jumped into bed and pulled the sheets over my face and tried to pretend that I hadn't seen what I had seen. But I had chosen not to. I had chosen to go down to the kitchen and to arm myself, to face the danger head on. And that's when I realized that the warehouse already had the one thing I needed. The lantern. Fire. Burning the monster had worked last time, and the ghost was lighting the lantern. Once it was lit, all I needed to do was break the glass and I would have access to an open flame. It wasn't a lighter and a can of butter spray, but it was better than nothing. And who knows, maybe the monster would see the fire, panic, and run away. It was furious that I had burned it all those years ago. It had to be afraid I would do it again. I heard a soft clicking sound, followed by a flaring huff as the lantern sprang to life. Light filled the room. I could see Zev supine on the mattress, staring blankly up at the ceiling. Val was gone. She must have run off into one of the corridors. Maybe she was smarter than I was. The floor between me and the ghost was empty and clear. I swallowed my fear and shoved myself off of the wall, throwing my torso forward with my arms. I managed to stick a foot out, catching myself, and then I swung my other leg forward. My heart was pounding, and I could feel cold sweat on the back of my neck. I stumbled at first, but the more I moved toward the ghost in the doorway, the easier it became, until I broke into a run, charging at the thing. All I had was the ordinary speed of my body, but I was built well for running, with long legs and a light frame. The ghost whirled around, turning its eye holes toward me, and the thing flinched. I heard a gasp from the hoarse voice coming from Zev's throat. The monster was gasping with surprise and fear. Confidence surged into me, and I bounded forward even faster, shoes slamming the pavement. I rushed at the ghost, flung out one arm, and seized the handle of the lantern. I pulled, and the lantern started slipping from the grip of the twisted cloth tendril. But then the ghost whirled, as though an invisible man beneath it was leaning back to throw his weight against my grip. The ghost's grip on the lantern tightened, and it managed to keep hold of it. We were abruptly locked into a tug-of-war. "Let go!" the hoarse voice screamed from behind me. I didn't let go. I planted my feet and pulled harder. I jerked the lantern toward me, and for a moment I thought I had yanked it free of the ghost's grip. But the blanket's twisted tendril hadn't left the lantern. Instead, the ghost allowed itself to be pulled toward me. The blanket floated through the air, using my own pulling force to propel itself at me, flowing over the lantern that was between us. I jerked and jumped back, letting go of the lantern, and only just in time. One corner of the blanket whipped past me, close enough that I could feel the wind of a strike that carried far more force than twisted fabric ought to. A phantom hand formed itself in the ghost's face, as though the invisible man underneath the blanket was reaching toward me from between the thing's eye holes. The hand raked at my face, and I threw myself backward to get away. Panic was surging into my muscles, and I threw myself backward and down, ducking under the blow. The attack missed me by centimeters, and the cloth fingers closed around a few stray strands of my hair and ripped them out of my head painfully. The hand was only the first strike in the ghost's attack. A twisted tendril of the blanket followed up the attack, whipping toward my legs. I tried to jump back to avoid the swing, but my upper body was crouched, making the motion awkward. I managed to fling myself backward, but lost my balance, waving my arms wildly in an attempt to avoid falling backward. It wasn't enough. My center of mass was too far back. I fell hard, my tailbone slamming onto the concrete floor. The pain disoriented me, But the ghost was still coming. It whirled and spun, whipping the lantern through the air, swinging it right at my face. I didn't have enough time to roll away, scramble back, or do anything but desperately throw one of my arms out in front of me, interposing it between the swinging lantern and my skull. The metal slammed against my left forearm with an explosion of agonizing pain and a sickening crunching sound. Horrible pain was accompanied by an awful sense of wrongness as I felt one of the bones in my forearm shift out of place as it fractured. The pain was excruciating, like a hot knife stabbing and twisting in my arm. A scream was ripped out of my lungs. I felt my legs thrashing upward, instinctually trying to kick at the thing that was attacking me. That was a mistake. I kicked at the blanket, but the fabric just melted against my feet, enveloping itself around my ankles. I started thrashing harder with my legs, trying to get away, but the blanket twisted itself around them, binding my ankles against each other, whirling its way up my calves until it had locked up my knees. Pain and terror overcame me completely. Agony was still shooting up my left arm, which had fallen limp onto my stomach. I wasn't sure I could move that arm even if I wanted to, but I started flailing desperately with my right hand, struggling to grab at the lantern that was still held in the ghost's grip. The ghost saw me grabbing at the lantern and simply tossed it aside. I heard the glass shatter as it fell to the ground behind me. Then the blanket fell on my torso, shoving my left arm aside with another paroxysm of agony. For a moment, I was relieved that the ghost merely shoved my left arm aside. The agony of even that small movement was incredible. But the blanket was still advancing, flowing up toward my face. It remained wrapped around my legs, but had just enough slack to leave my arms unbound and to fall onto my nose and mouth like 3 hands. One shoved my jaw up, slamming my teeth against each other. Another invisible hand pressed itself against my lips, squeezing them shut. The last hand grabbed my nose, clamping onto my nostrils. I tried to scream, but the trapped breath inside me simply puffed out my cheeks. The sound of it was muffled. Terror plunged my spine into a bath of ice water. I couldn't breathe. The ghost was going to suffocate me. I swung my good arm to grab at the fabric that was pressed against my face. I pulled, but the blanket resisted. I couldn't get a breath. I tried again, grabbing at the very edge of the blanket that hung just above my nose, trying to get a stronger grip. I pulled as hard as I could, bicep burning, and the blanket slipped. My nostrils flared as I pulled in a breath, but the blanket was writhing in my hand, pulling and tugging with strength that a damp piece of cloth should not have. The suffocating corner of the blanket ripped itself out of my grip and slammed back down on my nose with a fresh burst of pain that somehow managed to make itself heard over the continuing torment of the twisting hot knife in my left arm. I could hear the hoarse voice laughing and whooping, triumphant. I grabbed the blanket and pulled again, ripping it free and sucking another breath in through my nose, but the blanket kept thrashing in my grip, unrelenting. "Yes, struggle!" the voice cackled. I clung onto the blanket hard, but I could feel my arm already burning with exertion. The blanket started to slip from my grasp, but I clenched my teeth and yanked it back again. I couldn't hold it steady. I was breathing hard. My arms started shaking. The ghost was too strong. I knew I couldn't keep this up. I was going to die. "Drag out my revenge. You only make it sweeter," the monster taunted. I started thrashing, trying to move my legs. The ghost had wrapped them tightly together, but it wasn't exerting any force to keep them on the ground. I kicked out impotently, trying to force my knees apart, to rip the blanket down the middle, vainly hoping that damaging the thing would break its strength somehow. A quiet voice in my head whispered that I was wasting my own strength. But I couldn't have stopped thrashing if I wanted to. The terror of certain death was driving my actions. My movements were the mindless convulsions of a dying animal, a gazelle after the lion's teeth have already sunk into its neck. I lost my grip on the blanket and it fell onto my face, clamping over my nose, pressing hard against my mouth. I could hear the hoarse voice whooping and laughing. "Does it hurt? Yes. I want you to feel the agony of a slow end." I could feel my lungs burning. I knew that I wasn't strong enough to beat this thing. I knew that I was going to die. Despair settled on me like ice spreading over a lake. My legs were starting to tire. My thrashing movements started to die into feeble, impotent twitches. My lungs were on fire. The pain was technically less than the agony of my broken arm, but it was made worse by the fact that I knew it would kill me. The lack of oxygen was doing nothing to dull any of the pain. The hot knife in my arm was still twisting. There was going to be nothing peaceful about my final moments. The edges of my vision started turning gray. The fire in my chest got worse even than my fractured forearm. And even though I knew it was pointless, I knew I was only dragging this out, I couldn't stop myself. I lifted my right arm to grab the blanket again and yanked it hard off of my face. I sucked in a breath and then let go again, letting my hand fall to the ground in exhaustion. "Oh, this is good," the monster laughed. The blanket whipped back onto my nose and mouth. Everything hurt. So this was how it all ended for me, desperately clawing for every last breath, resting my right arm between breaths until I ran out of strength. Eventually, I would pull at the blanket without enough strength to lift it for another breath. I would realize that the breath I had taken before had been my last. And I couldn't even face my death with dignity. I was unable to stop myself from struggling, even though I knew I was just giving more joy and satisfaction to the monster that was killing me. I wanted to give up. I wanted this burning, excruciating pain to end. But the burning in my lung forced me to grab the blanket again and to steal another gasp of air, but not enough to make the burning in my lungs recede. I hated the fact that I was conscious of what was happening to me. I wished I could just give in to the panicked animal inside me, thrash and flail and die without being so goddamn aware of what was happening. But I wasn't an animal. I was lightheaded, but I could still think. Was I really going to just give up? If I wanted to go down fighting, to do it with some dignity, I could at least try to think of something. I grabbed at the blanket again and tugged hard, but it didn't budge. My strength was waning. The monster using Zev's voice laughed in delight. I ignored the laughter and pulled again, harder, twisting my shoulder and trying to throw some weight into it. The blanket slipped off of my nostrils, invisible fingers raking at my nose. I sucked in a breath. Strength surged into my arm, enough to keep my grip on the blanket for 2 more rapid breaths before the muscle in my arm gave in. The blanket slammed back onto my nose, so hard that I thought it might break it. I winced from the pain. It was amazing how many parts of my body could hurt simultaneously, and yet the novel pain of the blanket slamming into my nose still managed to drown out the pain in my broken arm and the pain in my lungs, if only for an instant. I was getting dizzy. It was hard to focus. I moved my legs experimentally. This time, I didn't try to force my knees apart. I focused on shoving my heels into the ground and pushing hard. My legs were running out of strength, along with the rest of my body. I didn't think I could do it, but somehow I managed to slide myself backward. Stinging pain lanced my shoulder as I slid over a shard of glass. I felt wetness under my t-shirt. The glass had sliced right through the shirt and cut into my skin. I sent my good hand, my right hand, groping behind me, feeling at the place where I had heard the glass shatter. Another piece of glass stabbed at the palm of my hand. I ignored the pain and continued to stretch my hand back into the sea of glass shards. Another ruthlessly sharp piece of glass sliced a tiny cut across my ring finger. But in that minefield of glass shards, my fingers finally felt something else. A narrow metal wire. The handle of the lantern. I grabbed it, pulled, and swung the now broken lantern forward onto my torso, onto the blanket that was stretching up from my bound legs to suffocate my mouth and nose. The glass was gone. There was no barrier between the ghost and the open flame. For a moment, the lantern was simply uncomfortably warm against my stomach. But then it started to burn. I gritted my teeth from underneath the blanket that was pressed against my mouth and kept the lantern where it was. I could feel the skin of my stomach burning, another fresh pain to distract from my broken arm and screaming lungs. But even though the heat was enough to hurt me, the blanket wasn't catching fire. The fabric was taut against my stomach, and even though the flame was right above it, the heat alone wasn't harming it. All I was doing was burning my own flesh. My lungs were on fire, too. It was getting hard to separate the pain of suffocation from the searing heat of the lantern. The ghost was still cackling, amused at my feeble efforts to free myself. I couldn't tell if the ghost realized that I was hurting myself with the flame of the lantern. If it noticed that, it would probably laugh even harder. I felt my strength leaving me. My grip on the lantern's handle went slack. I dropped it and heard it fall on the ground next to me. My eyes fluttered closed. The pain was excruciating, but beneath the pain was a bone-tiredness. When would the pain stop? Would it only be after I already drifted away? And then I heard it, echoing, distant, a hoarse voice screaming in pain. The blanket ripped itself off of my face, and I sucked in a breath. Pinpricks of light scattered across my vision. It felt like the fresh air was burning my lungs, but I couldn't stop myself from gasping in as much as I could. It was painful to breathe, but my hunger for air didn't care. I managed to focus my eyes and half raise my head, still gasping. The ghost was writhing and smoldering, still floating a few feet above the ground. I watched, dazed, panting for breath, as the blanket thrashed, patting itself out. I was still struggling to catch my breath, but my mind was waking up. I could feel the searing pain on my stomach where the fire had touched me, the burning of my lungs, and the hot knife in my left forearm. I ignored the pain and forced my oxygen-starved limbs into motion. I rose, using my right hand and keeping my left hand stiff against my side. I managed to struggle up to my feet, groaning as every motion caused shooting agony in my left arm. I stumbled up, bent over, grabbed the lantern in my good hand, and shoved it into the writhing, floating blanket. The blanket whirled back, fleeing, leaving a trail of smoke behind. I stumbled forward after it, coughing from the smoke. The blanket drifted drunkenly before falling to the ground in a heap, apparently dead. But I had fallen for that before. I still had the burn scars on my ankle to prove it. I shoved the lantern down at the blanket on the ground. The blanket had gone flat, so I placed the lantern on the ground and gathered the fabric, pulling it up and into the open flame. It only took a moment for the fire to catch. I kept my grip on the blanket tight, still wary. Flames started to spread. I held on until the flames had nearly reached my fingers and then thrust the thing down and took a step back. The movement caused the knife of pain in my left arm to twist again, but I ignored the shooting agony and stood watching as fire continued to spread over the blanket. That was when I heard a woman's voice behind me, Val's voice. I couldn't make out words. I was staring intently at the blanket on the ground, waiting for it to make a sudden move, to rise up and try to throw itself over me again. "Eliza, it's okay." I didn't turn to face her. How could she be sure? "It's safe. The monster's gone." I frowned, still staring at the blanket on the ground. The fire was starting to go out, leaving a huge hole in the blanket with charred edges. That wasn't enough. I had to burn the whole thing. "Eliza!" Val sounded worried. "I have to be sure," I called back. "It was using Zev to connect itself to this world, but I put him back to sleep. It's okay. I have to be sure," I repeated. Even if what Val had said was true, the blanket was still here. Even if Val had forced the monster out of Zev, she couldn't know for certain that it wasn't still inside the unburned parts of the blanket. My left arm screamed in agony that I ignored, apart from trying to hold that arm as stiff and still as I could. I reached down with my right hand and grabbed the blanket, avoiding the blackened parts in case they were still hot enough to burn my fingers. One-handed, I managed to gather the remains of the blanket into a ball. I tilted the lantern onto its side and stuck part of the balled-up blanket into the flame, careful to leave room for air to flow in on one side to keep the fire alive. Again, the blanket caught on fire, but this time the fire spread faster until the entire thing was enveloped in flames. The blanket smelled awful as it burned. It felt like it was cotton, but the smell of burning plastic indicated that there was probably some polyester in the blend. I ignored the smell and just stared down at the fire. I wouldn't look away until the entire thing was in ashes. I was still afraid. I couldn't not be afraid. This was the thing that had haunted my nightmares for my entire childhood. As I grew up, I had managed to convince myself that it had all been in my imagination. Everyone knew that monsters weren't real. But the scarecrow was real. It had come back as a ghost. And even though the thing was burning, I had burned it once before. There might be nothing to stop it from coming back a third time. I didn't know if I would ever feel safe again. Only when the fire started to die down did I glance away. When I finally looked at Val and Zev, what I saw horrified me. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted. Chapter 25. Val was on her knees next to the mattress. Her left hand was placed on Zev's forehead. Her right hand was placed on the back of the head of the other man who was kneeling beside her, Chalmers. He was looking vaguely in my direction. The man's eyes were rolled up into the back of his head, and his left arm was twitching. Death throes. Val was killing him. I started running at the three of them before I could think. I had to stop her before... But as I reached them, Reuben Chalmers slumped forward. All I could do was stare in horror as the man's face fell onto the concrete with a sickening thump. He had made no motion to stop his head from slamming onto the ground. I looked at the young-looking woman kneeling beside the body. Val looked back at me. She was panting with exertion, but her expression was one of relief. There was no trace of horror on her face, despite what she had just done. "This death is on my conscience, not yours," she said breathily. I felt my head starting to shake from side to side. My right hand balled itself into a fist. My left arm was still hanging, stiff and painful. No. Val has just committed murder. Could I have stopped her? Had I not tried hard enough? Behind Val, I could see Zev starting to stir. I wanted Zev to be okay, but not like this. My throat was tight with emotion, anger, shock. I had just seen a man die right in front of me. And guilt. Guilt that part of me still thought that Chalmers had been a loathsome man, that I had wanted Zev to be okay more than I had wanted that man to continue living. I knew that part of me thought that maybe Chalmers deserved what he'd got. Had I allowed this to happen? My obsession with burning that blanket, refusing to even look away from it until it was in ashes. But I'd thought that Chalmers had gotten away. He had run out of the room, knocking the door out of the wall as he went. I managed to choke out a word. How? He didn't see me coming, Val said, still trying to catch her breath. Not until I'd gotten a hand on him. How could you? That was what I had meant. I just stared at her, and at the body face down on the floor in front of her. You should know what he was doing when I found him, Val said. Her voice was very quiet. He had turned back, halfway down the hill, but coming back toward the warehouse, she continued. Wretched man though he was, Perhaps he didn't want to be a coward. He owed you for helping him escape. Val looked down at the body on the ground and frowned. One action doesn't change who he was, she said, or what he did to that girl. Val nodded to herself. She was convincing herself that she had done the right thing. The young-looking woman rose to her feet slowly. She was still looking down at the body of the man she had just killed, disdain in her expression. Maybe, Val said, if he's lucky, it will have been enough to save him from punishment in the hereafter. It shocked me hearing her say that. I remembered the handful of times I had seen Val cross herself, though most of the time it had seemed rather half-hearted. I remembered the time that she complained that she shouldn't have given up sugar for Lent. Those parts of Val were real, I realized. She really did believe in God. But she also believed that she had the right to judge a man, to sentence him to death so that someone else could live. And here she was, standing over the body of a man she had murdered and musing about whether or not he was going to hell. Did Val think she was any better? It sounded like she did. Val held Chalmers in contempt. He had killed someone by accident, by negligence. He was culpable, but killing someone had not been his intention. Val had just killed someone on purpose. I clenched my right fist tighter and felt an electric burst of pain as my left hand reported that those fingers did not want to move and would not form a second fist, no matter how angry I was. The renewed burst of pain caused me to flinch and scowl. Val took a step toward me. "I should take a look at that arm," she said. I shook my head and took a step back from her. The knife in my left arm twisted again. Val's expression softened. I thought I could see hurt in her eyes. We looked at one another for a second, and then her eyes hardened. Abruptly, Val whipped forward, closing the distance between us with startling speed. Before I could even react, her hand was lashing out toward my left shoulder, attacking my injured side. I flinched back and tried to raise my good hand to hold off her assault, but her hand made contact with my shoulder before I could do anything. And the moment she touched me, I stopped short. I wondered why I was trying to resist, to rebuff the comfort she was offering me with one hand on my shoulder. I looked into her bright green eyes, so bright they were practically glowing. Those eyes looked back at me. "Calm down," her voice said, sounding like it was coming from everywhere at once. I could tell immediately that Val's power was different. She was touching me and focusing harder. Last time I had been able to throw her off, but this time the voice in my head wasn't a whisper. It was both at once a warm, comforting presence and also a crushing weight that shoved my doubts and resistance aside. "Everything is going to be fine," Val said. And everything was fine. The pain in my arm all but vanished. The sudden, instant relief made my eyes water. Val was moving. She walked over to me and carefully grabbed my arm. It didn't hurt as she carefully inspected it, even when she pressed it lightly with her fingers. "Not a full break, most likely a partial fracture," Val said. Her voice was calm, professional. "For now, I want you to cradle it in your right arm. I'm making the pain go away, but I want you to remember that the arm is still hurt. Try not to move it." Val moved my arms into place, and I let her, until I was cradling my arm as she said. I was breathing heavily, panting from both sweet relief and my recent exertion. The simple lack of the pain felt so good that I practically wanted to sing with joy. Part of me knew that it was Val's magic, but it was immutable. It was a fact of my being, not a whisper that I could try to argue with and suppress. The whisper was my own thoughts, a fuzzy, weak voice at the edge of my conscious awareness. "It hurts! She's lying! It hurts!" I knew that Val's power was flowing into me, but I welcomed it. There was no reason to worry about it. I didn't feel worried about anything. Everything was okay. Everything else, all that pain and worry, my own voice whispering that my arm was hurting, it was nothing but the buzzing of a fly on the other side of a window screen. I looked down at Zev. He was stirring slightly, but his eyes were still closed. It looked like he was having an intense dream or something like that. That was when I noticed it. The last time I had looked at Zev, I saw the edges of angry red burns peeking out from underneath his bandages. But now, every bit of exposed skin that I could see was healed. The life force that Val had ripped from Chalmers and channeled into Zev must have been responsible for that. That was fine, I thought. Everything was fine. I heard a buzzing whisper in my ear, and for a second felt a twinge of pain in my arm. I flinched and tried to ignore the whisper. I didn't want the pain back. The whisper vanished, and the pain with it. I breathed out a sigh of relief. I stood, placidly, staring down at Zev. "He's not going to remember the truth of this world," Val said. "The power I gave him will make him forget." I found that I was able to speak. I asked the question that was on my mind. "How?" "I don't know exactly," Val said. "I believe that when you take power from another into your own soul, the energy is different from what it will become when it is truly integrated, digested, if you will." Her tone was one of a satisfied teacher. She was glad that our argument was over and that she could share her knowledge with me. She was forcing me to be what she wanted. The pain in my arm flared again, and again I wanted it gone. Instantly and viscerally yearned for the relief that the warmth in my mind gave me. For a moment, I could feel the frustration of the rebellious part of my mind. It knew that the pain was making it harder for it to reach me. How could I make myself want the pain back? And not just physical pain, all the fear and uncertainty. I had spent days balanced on the edge of a knife, struggling to hold it together. I was tired. It was a welcome relief when that buzzing whisper in my head faded away. I basked in the warmth that filled my mind, the relief from stress and pain. It was over. It was finally over. Everything was going to be okay. Val was still talking. "It is in the first few minutes that one experiences healing of the body, including regression of age to one's prime," she said. "I believe the madness Zev was suffering from was like an injury of the mind, to be healed in the same manner." I pondered that for a moment. It was strange talking so casually about the effects of killing someone and extracting energy out of them. I didn't like it. It made my arm hurt. I wanted to change the subject. And there was something else I wanted to ask. "How do you know that he's going to forget everything? Have you seen it before?" As I asked the question, I couldn't help but think again of the burning building, the image of the flames licking like snake tongues out of the window of Northside, the roar and the heat, the strange, inexplicable feeling that the fire was my fault. Val frowned before answering. It was strange. Suspicious. No, not suspicious. Everything was fine. "I heard about something similar once," Val said, just in passing. Val looked at me. Her face was so earnest, I couldn't help but trust her. Another buzz of pain. I swatted it away. Zev groaned. My eyes snapped over to him. Was he hurt? Was it not working? "He will wake soon," Val said. "Is he?" "It's normal," Val said. "What he is experiencing is like a very vivid dream. When he wakes up, he will have concocted a version of events that his mind can accept." "You mean he won't know about—" "I expect not. His mind will be fragile. We should be careful with him." "Meaning?" "Whatever he says he thinks happened to him, go along with it." I frowned at that. I didn't want to lie to Zev. Val saw my expression and stared at me, her expression firm. "You saw what happened," she said. "It's a risk we cannot afford." That was a good point. All right, I said, nodding. Val looked satisfied and turned away from me. She bent down to examine Zev, who was still stirring slightly. His eyelids fluttered and his lips twitched. But there was something about what Val had said that tickled the back of my mind. I heard about something similar once, just in passing. That claim was at complete odds with the confidence with which Val was describing what was happening to Zev. It sure sounded like she had witnessed this sort of thing happening before, firsthand. Why was she being so evasive? You know why. I gasped in sudden pain as the hot knife drove itself back into my arm. Excruciating pain knocked me off balance, and I fell to my knees. I could feel something inside my head, a disturbing and unwelcome presence, like a spider crawling around in my mind. I could feel Val in my head, too, that warm blanket that had settled over the pain in my arm. The spider was crawling around on it, disturbing the comfort the blanket offered me. I wanted to squish the spider, to attack it, to make it go away, but I couldn't do anything to the spider from this side of the blanket. That was when the spider attacked, sinking its fangs into the warm blanket and injecting venom through the thin barrier. I felt the assault as an explosion of agonizing pain, so excruciating that I couldn't think or react or do anything but scream. I tried to fight against the part of me that was grasping onto the pain, forcing me to experience it, but it was too late. The pain itself crashed over my mind like a wave, knocking me off my feet and throwing me into drowning disorientation. The pain brought something else with it, a searing flash of sounds and moving images. It was like a daydream, but all happening in an instant, like a laser was burning a full sensory hallucination straight into my mind, into my memory, and skipping the usual interface of eyes and ears. The sun was setting behind the buildings by the time we finally stepped into the battered little two-door. It was cramped. I had become accustomed to more space for my knees from the van. Feeling freakishly tall, I adjusted the passenger seat backwards as far as it could go. You really trust him with your car? Well, he always leaves it with a full tank, I said. You sure you don't mind dropping me off? I can get him to come pick me up. Don't worry about it. I actually wanted to talk to you about something. I felt my breath catch. This was it, I thought. Zev was right. The Weekleys were dead. We were all out of a job. Val laid her hand on my shoulder. My first impulse was to find the gesture annoying. I didn't want Val thinking of me like some sort of little kid who needed to be comforted. But at the same time, there was something profoundly intimate about it. An indication that Val thought of me as more than just an employee or coworker. It was an acknowledgement that Val was more than just my boss. She was my mentor. But it also meant that she was about to give me terrible news. I braced myself. I want to ask you for a favor, Val said. I blinked in confusion. Favor? What favor? Was she going to ask me not to freak out over getting fired? But first, I have to explain some things. Things that might shock you. I need you to trust me, and to stay calm. I was on the ground. The pain in my arm was so sharp that all I could do was scream. I could hear a voice shouting to me, Val's voice, but it couldn't get past the sound of my own voice, crying out in agony as the white-hot knife in my arm twisted. It felt like that heavy steel lantern was striking it again and again and again. I welcomed it when I felt another vision coming, anything to make the pain go away. I was in the cramped passenger seat, staring up at the sky. A pillar of black smoke was rising into the horizon, black against the orange clouds of sunset. But then I blinked, and the smoke was gone. The landscape suddenly shifted. I was at the top of a hill, looking up at the orange horizon that stretched above the tree line. The forest was thick around us. The old bricks of the button factory looked even redder under the light of the setting sun. I don't want to hurt her, Val said, but we have to stop her before she brings death on all of us. I frowned, but nodded. I understood perfectly. It was strange. Val had said so many incredible, unbelievable things. But I believed all of it. I just knew that Val was right about everything, and that it would all be fine if I just did what she said. All I need you to do is keep her talking. I'll sneak up behind her while she's distracted. The vision was suddenly cut off, and the pain was gone. I realized that I was on my back on the concrete floor, gasping for breath. Val was kneeling in front of me. I was breathless and confused. I became aware of the fact that Val's hand was resting lightly on my forehead. "Calm down," Val said. "It's all okay." Her words rang in my ears like the chiming of a bright silver bell. And everything was fine again. I shoved thoughts of that disturbing vision aside. I didn't want to think about it anymore. "I know that part of you is still very upset with me for what I did to save Zev," Val said, "but I promise, if you want to argue about it, we can do that later. But at this moment, we need to be on the same page, for Zev's sake." Upset? I didn't feel upset at all. Everything felt nice. Even though I knew that I was laying on hard concrete, I was as comfortable as if I was laying in a warm bed with a hot cup of coffee while it was snowing outside. I heard the mattress creaking, and my heart surged with joy. I scrambled up, only barely managing to remember to avoid using my bad arm, and rushed over to Zev's side. He was blinking and muttering under his breath. All my muscles were suddenly pulled tight with tension. Was the monster back inside him? "Zev!" I cried. "Are you okay?" "What do you remember?" Val asked. "Jesus," Zev groaned. "You don't have to yell." Val obediently dropped to a whisper. "There was an accident," she said. "I think you hurt your head. What do you remember?" Zev's eyes abruptly opened wide, and he suddenly scrambled back, off the mattress and onto the concrete floor. He moved fast, but not crazy fast, not supernaturally fast. I was on my knees next to the mattress, but Val reached out to touch my shoulder from where she stood behind me. Her hand was warm and comforting. Why was I so afraid? Zev was all right. He was better than all right. He was in good enough health to jump up out of bed. And he sounded like himself. That eerie voice that had taken over his mouth was gone. Zev was staring at me and Val, his breath labored, his eyes wide. I laughed. "It's okay, Zev," I said. "Everything's okay now." Zev shook his head jerkily. "No," he said. "No, it's not okay, Eliza. People are dead." My own eyes widened, but before I could react, I felt Val's hand tighten slightly on my shoulder. And then I realized that whatever Zev was talking about didn't matter. I was just so glad that he was okay after everything that had happened. My left arm was tingling. It was uncomfortable, but I could ignore it. "I don't know what you know," Val said from behind me. Her voice was calm, her tone clearly intended to come across as soothing. "Or how, but I can't explain." I had really needed this. Some relief from all the tension and chaos. I was absolutely suffused with joy at seeing Zev safe. I wanted to rush over to him, to throw my arms around him, but I remembered that my arm was broken and that I wasn't supposed to move. So instead, I started to open my mouth. I wanted to vouch for Val, to tell him who this young woman that he might not recognize was. She was our editor. We knew her. We could trust her. But I felt the grip on my shoulder, and I knew, instinctively, that it would be better to stay quiet. Val could handle this. I don't know you," Zev was saying. "Yes," Val said, "you do." Val started moving toward Zev, and I felt my legs following along, effortlessly, almost as if they were moving on their own. Zev started backing away and moving left, moving to place me between him and Val. But my own legs were pivoting too, turning around in a circle. It seemed like I should have been alarmed at the way my legs were moving on their own, but it felt like what my legs ought to be doing. It felt good and right. I swatted down another whispering buzz in my ear and winced at the sudden surge of pain in my arm. It was an unwelcome distraction from the dance we were doing. I had never felt like this, like a graceful ballerina. I was grinning. I had never had this much fun dancing before. I'd never really done it before. I should have given it a try sooner. Val had one hand on my shoulder and was moving next to me, while Zev was continuing to sidle away from her to try to put me in the middle of the two of them. It took me a moment to register it beneath the delight I was having in the dance, but Val and Zev were still talking. "Look at me, Zev," Val was saying. "Look into my eyes. You do know me." "No," Zev said. "I clearly don't know you at all." "My face is different now, but my eyes are the same." "I do know your face," Zev said. His breathing was slower, but his posture remained tight and agitated. Our dancing suddenly stopped. I felt the tension in the fingers on my shoulder relax a little. "Yes, you do," Val murmured. "Your face," Zev said. "It was one of the last things the man with the sad eyes saw, before you killed him." I could feel Val's shock at the statement. I felt it as her control slipped, and her own thoughts poured into me. Was he reaching beyond the veil of death? Was it even possible? Val was terrified at the very idea. I could feel her mind against my mind. It was like the hand on my shoulder, but different. Uglier. It was like Val's hand had plunged into my back, like I was a ventriloquist dummy. I felt the hand, how it had slid up my spine, up through my neck to grasp onto my brain. "Now, while she's distracted!" The white-hot knife stabbed into my arm. I felt excruciating pain traveling up my spine. It slipped through Val's fingers and rushed into my head, where it found its target. A thin and effervescent barrier, like a curtain. The hot knife plunged into the curtain and ripped into it, and another searing vision poured into my mind. This has been Slug It, written by Charles Bran, narrated by Larissa Thompson. Copyright 2020 by Charles B. Kreutzkamp. Production copyright 2021 by Charles B. Kreutzkamp.